Hello, welcome to another episode of Axis of Resistance Initiative, which this one is quite timely given to the exchange of fire between Iranian and Israelis. But we both are in luck because today we have a special guest. Our guest is Dr. Vali Nasr. Dr. Vali Nasr is a Majid Khadouri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at the Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where he served as the 8th Dean of it from 2012 to 2019. Previously, he also served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Ambassador Richard Hallberg, between 2009 to 2010. Dr. Nasr also has advised senior American policymakers, thought leaders, businesses, including the President, Secretary of the State, senior member of the Congress, and presidential campaigns. He has been writing for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. He is a very well-known and internationally known author. Among his many publications that he has, we can mention the Shia Revival, the How Sanctions Work, Iran, and the Impact of Economic Warfare, which I had the pleasure of having a conversation with him previously. And his latest, Iran's Grand Strategy, which we are today to talk about that and kind of to make it a tie between that book and the events of today. Dr. Nasr, once again, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you on our program, as always.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Dr. Nasr, in our last round of conversation about your book on sanction, we began the conversation with a spoiler question. And if you don't mind, let's do it again this time.
Sure.
I want to ask you that, did the Iran's, given to what is happening right now on June 17, which we are having the conversation, did Iran's grand strategy work? Has it achieved its objective? To what grade you would give it to it as a scholar and a professor?
So no, the short answer is no. I mean, the grand strategy essentially has been for Iran to survive, thrive, and develop in resistance to the United States and its allies in the region, to basically follow a strategy of decoupling from the regional order in order to grow, and also to follow confrontation with Israel and with the United States at the same time as it wants to develop itself economically. The strategy hasn't worked because for a very long time, it actually has constrained Iran economically. In other words, the more that it has fought against the US and Israel, the more sanctions it has invited, and the more isolated this economy has become. So I start my book by basically saying that a decade or so ago, Iran embraced with the supreme leaders' blessing a Vision 2025, which, like very many other visions, anticipated Iran would become economically developed, would be leading in many areas of industry and business by 2025 in West Asia. And that hasn't happened because the economic toll of its strategy of resistance. And then over the past 2-3 years, we've seen that this strategy has now become so costly that the Iranian public is revolted against it. It no longer subscribes to its fundamental assumptions, to its logic, to its wisdom. And then in practice also, it has reached the limits of its usefulness. In other words, the unraveling of Hezbollah, the loss of Syria, and now even being in a war, outright war with Israel, and potentially a war with the United States, suggests that not only is the strategy costly, but the strategy has really brought Iran to the edge of a major reckoning that from which I don't think the strategy itself can survive in its current form.
Thank you. I'm very much glad that you mentioned the Iran's system of alliances, the state and non-state actor, in that case Syria, and also Hezbollah, you mentioned both. And I noticed that you also dedicate an entire chapter of your book to the axis of resistance. I think it's a chapter 9, which is great. We are lucky because our initiative is for the axis of resistance. One of the things that I noticed in your book is that you compared Iran's regional policy, and you kind of referred to it a couple of times. Actually, it was earlier this morning. And by the way, I have the book on my background, and the audience can find a link to it in the bottom of this, in the caption of this video. But anyways, one of the things that I very much liked in your book, you refer to the axis of resistance and Iran's regional policy in general as the forward policy, or the forward defense, which is, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a resemblance of what the British pursued in the 18th and 19th centuries to protect India. which evidently, led to the great gains. They had the naval domination, but on ground they felt vulnerabilities, so they formed alliances with Iranian on and off, and with the Punjabis. But Iran has been trying to do so. Iran has realized that conventionally they cannot really be, a great match for the United States. They are not a match for the United States or the U.S. allies. So they use the proxies. And you just mentioned that it reached its limits, the use that it can, the extent and the use it can have. It's very interesting for me, and I think for most of our audience, that why the axis of resistance as Iran's regional proxy was quite effective through the war on terror, even through let's say the initial stage of the Arab Spring. But for all of a sudden, the last 2 years, it start to, I don't want to say collapse, but it has lost a good chunk of its effectiveness. Do you think it's because of the lack of resource to Iran? Is it because of the lack of the absence of the General Soleimani, which in your book you also many times mention his names? What happened to axis of resistance that it is not what it used to be?
So it's a number of things. I mean, of course, Soleimani matters, and this is particularly on the tactical level, because let's say if he was alive, he may have made different sets of decisions before October 7th, Hamas attack on Israel, after October 7th, etc., that his successors probably made different decisions. So there's always personalities do matter. But I think the larger issue is that, this is a strategy that gradually evolves. I mean, Iran first established Hezbollah in Lebanon, or helped establish Hezbollah in Lebanon in the 1980s as a one-off strategy of trying to deal with what it saw as a rising Israeli threat to Iran. And the strategy proved successful. So, you have to take that into account. It was a successful strategy. Hezbollah between 1982 and 2000 became strong enough to force Israel to leave Lebanon. So it's the first time Israelis involuntarily were forced to leave an Arab territory. And for a very long time, Hezbollah took credit that it was the only Arab military force to have defeated Israel. Now, these may be outlandish claims, but it's important that those who are making these claims, what they read into it. So Iran saw benefit in this idea of having militia allies in the Arab world and using militias essentially as the deterrence against Israel and pressure against Israel. And all the way from 2000 to 2023, for about a quarter of a century, presence of Hezbollah in Lebanon, its ability to launch missiles against Israel, served as a deterrence against the kinds of attacks that Israel is now carrying out against Iran. So the strategy worked in that sense. Then, you had the the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, which Iran viewed as a direct threat to it, because had the United States succeeded in Iraq, then it would have gone into Iran. And I narrate in the book how seriously Iran took the presence of the U.S. in Iraq, and also the invasion of Iraq came against the background of Iran helping the United States to topple the Taliban in 2001, only to be put on the axis of evil list by President Bush. So the Iranians were very nervous. And at that point in time, General Soleimani very successfully organizes a counterinsurgency in Iraq among the Shias, and then collaborates with Syria, which supports the Sunni insurgency. Those insurgencies confound the U.S. presence in Iraq. The United States never succeeds in Iraq, let alone contemplating going from Baghdad to Tehran or to Damascus. And, strategies are built around these kinds of successes. So out of Iraq, General Soleimani and the Quds force become far more powerful and influential in Iran's security thinking. And the idea that comes out of Iraq is that Iran successfully defended against the United States by being in Iraq. And also being in Iraq means you prevent Iraq from ever again becoming a threat to Iran, whether it was under Saddam Hussein or with U.S. presence there. So this pacification of threat from Iraq, Arab threat, as well as American threat, becomes forward defense, meaning you defend Iran from inside the Arab world, not from inside the Iranian world. You defend against Israel from Lebanon, not from inside Iran, which is right now happening, right? And the strategy works. I mean, just because it's not working today, it does not mean that it was unsuccessful in 2003 or between 1982 and between 2000 and 2023 for Hezbollah. Then Syria, which had been an ally of Iran, becomes a very important issue because Iran concludes that if Assad fell in 2012, 2013, that then Iraq would not be defensible. And therefore, you end up in a domino theory, much like the British that you mentioned, that we have control of Iraq with the Shia government, with these allies, we've neutralized the US. Now, if we lose Syria, then we'll be defending. And then you have the rise of ISIS, and this is where Iran really builds its capabilities inside Syria and inside Iraq, and it thinks it was successful. I mean, General Soleimani came out of the fight against ISIS as a hero within Iran's security establishment. All these pictures he was taking with PMF troops, etc. And in Syria, Iran was supported by Russian air cover. In Iraq, it was supported by American air cover, negotiated through the Iraqi army. But again, its presence in the Arab world, in the eyes of Iran, protected Iran from the rise of a vicious anti-Iranian, anti-Shia, Sunni force in Syria and Iraq. And so, this basically then becomes, Iran basically leans into a strategy that is successful. Now, I think this unravels, not just because Iran didn't have the money, because when Hamas attacked Israel for the first year of the war, it looked like this strategy was working.
Yes.
But what Iran had not prepared for was the kind of Israel that emerged from the Gaza war. An Israel that is far more willing to take risk, was not willing to be deterred. And I think the turning point actually came before the collapse of Hezbollah. It came when Israel, in April of 2023, I believe that was it, that's the date, attacked Iran's consulate in Damascus. When it attacked Iran's consulate, what became obvious is that Hezbollah is no longer a deterrent against Israel. The Israelis are not deterred by the fact that Hezbollah may retaliate. And Iran at that point in time makes the decision that it's not going to retaliate with Hezbollah. It's going to retaliate directly from inside Iran. So I think the forward defense, which is the I would say military doctrine or a strategic doctrine that lay at the foundation of the idea of axis of resistance. The axis of resistance are these groups that are loosely allied and trained and funded and armed by Iran, but the idea behind it is forward defense. It's at that point that forward defense no longer is the front player. In fact, I think that's the point at which in Iran, I mean, both of those generals that have been now assassinated, the commander who was running the missiles and drones was beginning to argue that the funding and the attention in IRGC should go to his division, not to the Quds force, because ultimately it's his division that's doing the heavy lifting now in deterring Israel and confronting Israel. So I think that's the point that change came. And then the decimation of Hezbollah and the fall of Syria ultimately put a nail in the coffin, if you would, of both the axis and forward defense. I think the problem for Iran was that this now happened too quickly before Iran could basically create a substitute strategy. And I think Israel understands this, and why Israel doesn't want a nuclear deal and wants to bomb Iran is not because of the nuclear issue. I think it's the larger issue that a nuclear deal would give Iran breathing space in order to basically shore up its strategic defenses against Israel, to come up with a successor strategy to forward defense. And Israel doesn't want to give Iran that time. It wants to take the fight to Iran before Iran, doubles down on its missile strategy and has a much bigger arsenal, or before it can come up with something else. So this is a moment of strategic vulnerability that Israel wants to exploit to give a decisive blow to Iran.
So they had a momentum. I kind of I have a question that I want to, while I want to, advance the conversation toward the forward, but I want to ask a question about something that you mentioned earlier, that the policy worked for about a quarter of the century, for 20 years. It deterred Israelis from making attacks such as today. And you then, toward the end of it, you bring the October 7th, which many people today make an argument that it kind of, triggered a degree of survivalist instinct in the Israelis, that they were not just willing to take any risk. But aside that, I wanted to ask you that, what's your take on a parallel argument, not in contrast, but in parallel? One of the other arguments that I've seen out there is that they make a case, some of our colleagues, that Iran went through a process that some people argue that it was the reason or the cause of the collapse of the Roman Empire, meaning it extended itself too much, that it stretched too thin, the resources couldn't be allocated, properly. If I want to ask you quickly, do you think is it applicable to the Iran's axis of resistance? Did Iran grow too fast and too big?
Well, but that's not the reason for the collapse. I mean, I do think that this was, just because it was successful in deterring Israel does not mean that it was necessarily a good idea. Mm-hmm. First of all, it's a very costly strategy, both in terms of money that Iran had to allocate to these groups at a time when it itself is under massive sanctions. Secondly, the strategy is costly because it actually did invite sanctions. For instance, it's this strategy that becomes the main argument against the 2015 nuclear deal. So Iran, on the one hand, wants to use the nuclear deal in order to gain economic breathing room, improve its economy, stabilize its relations with the West. But at the same time, is the forward defense, as it's unfolding in Syria at the time, actually undoes that. In other words, it brings fresh sanctions, maximum pressure, destroys the nuclear deal. So Iran is caught between two strategic initiatives. One is which is pursued by President Rouhani, also accepted by the Supreme Leader. The other one, which is pursued by General Soleimani, and is also approved by the Supreme Leader. And this problem was articulated in complaints by Foreign Minister Zarif in the term of the clash between diplomacy and the battlefield, and Maidan, as he called it, which says that there was a massive contradiction at the core of this. Secondly, there is a point at which the Iranian people no longer subscribe to the logic of forward defense. They begin to balk at the cost. It's too costly. We don't have jobs. Why is money going to Hezbollah? And it's very difficult for the government in Iran to explain a defense that has an Arab face and it's not inside Iran and it's looked upon by the world as terrorism. It's one thing to tell your population that I need to spend money on tanks and airplanes and soldiers, and here they are, they're Iranian, they're sitting in these bases, and this is the reason we need to do it, because there's a threat right on our border. But it's much more what you would call it is much more fuzzy to tell them Hezbollah is somehow a defense arm of Iran, right? Mm-hmm. And it's sitting over there, and we need to actually have this outpost, 2 countries away from us on the Mediterranean in order to defend Iran. And it also raised other sets of questions, which, let's say, a country like Egypt went through when it transitioned from Nasr to Sadat. I mean, Sadat decided, we can keep fighting Israel for another generation, but it is too expensive. Maybe we shouldn't be fighting Israel at all. So there's this group of Iranians basically started saying that thing, that, yes, you have a problem with America, with Israel, fix the problem. Stop coming up with expensive ways to fight them, which is really at the core of the dissent that you begin to see in civil society, in among people who begin to follow exile, voices, because they basically are now even questioning the need for that defense. Not only whether the defense itself makes sense, etc., but why do you need to spend so much money against Israel? Wouldn't it be cheaper if you made peace with Israel? Anyways, what's your problem with Israel? Right? You don't have a shared territory like with Iraq. There's no water you like with Afghanistan that you need to share. You know, you're doing this for the Palestinians. We're not even Arab. You're being more Arab than the Arabs. And once the population begins to question national strategy, then you're in trouble, right? Because you cannot convince them of the necessity of the struggle. And here's the difference between 1980s when Iran was fighting Iraq, 2003 when Iran said we need to stabilize Iraq and we need to be present in Iraq, and 2016 to 2023 when Iran is engaged in the Levant, right?
Yes.
Now, I don't think domestic pressure forced the break of forward defense. I think, you know, the problem was that, and it's not that Iran did not have money to give Hezbollah, or Hezbollah didn't have 10,000, 20,000, missiles. It is that Iran's missiles there was, I think at some point, was essentially to prevent Israel from taking an offensive posture vis-a-vis Iran. And as you mentioned, the post-October 7th Israel was not the pre-October 7th Israel. I mean, if Israel thinks it's okay to hit Iran's consulate and doesn't care about whether Hezbollah is going to hit it or not, in fact, it may welcome being hit because then it will invade Lebanon, then your whole deterrence doctrine has fallen apart, right? Then those missiles are not protecting Iran. And Iran did not want to start a war with Israel, so there was no purpose to those missiles other than the fact that they were supposed to deter Iran. And this begins to arrive. And then, obviously you have a tactical success by Israel, which is the intelligence coup against Hezbollah, the pager attack, and then the assassination of Nasrallah, which causes basically the collapse of Hezbollah. And then Israel does something else, which is that it destroys over 100,000 Shia houses in South Lebanon and in South Beirut, fully understanding that Iran no longer financially can afford to pay to rebuild them. And if it does, it would cause trouble at home, which means that it really cannot help rebuild Hezbollah to where it was in quick order. Now, the fall of Syria was not Israel's doing. That largely was a Turkish operation. If you were to sort of see where HTS came from, it came out of Idlib. So yes, it was because of the fighting in Gaza and with Lebanon, but it was not a direct Israeli operation. But if your whole strategy is vulnerable to a Turkish operation, to an Israeli operation, then it's not really that strong. And secondly, and you get to a point that Israel is actually no longer afraid of Hezbollah missiles, then the whole strategy has to be is no longer serving the purpose that it once did. So the successes that it could claim in Lebanon 1982 to 2023, in Iraq in 2000 to 23 onwards, in Syria, that no longer held. So I think Iranian generals, security officials alone sitting in war room, not talking to people, politicians, people who are in charge of the defense of the country, have two options. You either actually do what Sadat did, as I said, just say, okay, it's over, let's go make peace with Israel. We're no longer in the business of doing this. Or if you're still in the business of resistance, then you have to come up with something else. And that something else had not formed yet when Israel attacked last week.
They grabbed the momentum. I'm very much happy that you mentioned the intelligence coup, because it brings us to the current event, what happened on Friday night, which more than about 12 Iranian scientists, nuclear scientists, and almost 15 with the 6 new names that they yesterday announced, Iranian IRGC commander being killed. Which brings us to a debate that I'm kind of, having with myself, and I'm sure many people have. On one hand, we have seen the impact of, the decapitation of the elimination of the leadership on Hezbollah. It paralyzed it after the death of the Nasrallah, and earlier, Nasrallah, and then the Shoker a little bit earlier before that. We've seen Hezbollah's behavior change. They had a very hard time to, to get their command center together. But we also have the Iran's case in 1981, in the peak of the war with Iraq, when the president of a country was impeached. Bani Saad left the country. His successor, Mr. Rajai, and the prime minister of the country, among a very large number of other officials, been killed in a terrorist attack, in a bombing of the prime minister office. And we had, Iran had issues with the in Kurdistan, in Baluchistan, there was an on and off ethnic uprising. But despite all of those assassinations, despite being in a full-fledged war, the command center or command system of Iran get itself together, and it continued war actually for about 8 years after that. Which way now is the path ahead for the Iranians? Right now, can they continue? Can they go? Can they do what they did during Iran and Iraq, or is going to be they're going to have the fate of the Hezbollah?
Well, I mean, whether they can continue or not is contingent on many other things, including popular support. The Iranian public is very different from the Iranian public of the 1980s, which was still very supportive of the revolution, believed in it, etc. So I would say, the fact that these commanders were killed in Iran recently, it was an intelligence failure, but it also was a miscalculation by them, because they assumed that military attack will not come until the talks had actually failed. So there was an element of taking President Trump as his word, that unless diplomacy fails, there won't be war. So it's diplomacy or war. So when the attack came 2 days before the 6th round, they were caught off guard, that they were not anticipating it coming. So the locations were obviously an intelligence failure, but the fact that they were not hidden in the bunkers, some of them were sitting at home with their families and died with their families, suggests to you that they didn't think it was coming yet, that they had more time. However, I would say that the intelligence failure in Iran is tied to the intelligence failure with Israel. I mean, one of the things the Iranians lost to Israel is not immediately the military battle. They lost the intelligence battle. Israel was able to penetrate Hezbollah. It's been able to penetrate Iran. Plugging intelligence holes is not easy, because you have to find, high-level people who are working. It's going to take time. And it's part of that period, as I mentioned, that Iran needed to get its bearing again. And it's exactly what Israel does not want to give it. However, the death of these commanders, etc., has not been as devastating to Iran as it was to Hezbollah. In the case of Hezbollah, the pagers were more important than killing Nasrallah, because the pagers killed a large number of commanders and sub-commanders and people below them. And then there was also assassination of 15 top commanders, and then Nasrallah. So the entire decision-making layers of Hezbollah went, to the point that people would say that even there are missiles that nobody knows where they are, because all the people who knew where they were, and usually these were in cell structures, everybody's killed in that unit. So nobody knows where these things are. And in the case of Iran, actually, the Revolutionary Guards looked like they regrouped very quickly. Iran started retaliating against Israel the day after, which means that their ability to manage war, a sort of a command and control, is still there. Now, whether Israel is able to degrade it further, whether they can basically hide now effectively, it all remains to be seen. But at the moment, Iran's problem is not that its command and control military command and control has failed. It faces two issues. One is that Israel is going after the Iranian state itself, trying to make Iran ungovernable, from attacking cities, ordering evacuation of cities. I mean, if you ask 12 million people, scare 12 million people, it becomes very difficult to govern over them. It creates chaos, it creates mayhem. And then you hit the refineries, electrical grids, water plants. There are car bombings in Tehran. I mean, all of this put together is designed to overwhelm the state. And then you hit radio and television, etc. So these are all instruments of governance, right? There, I think Iran is more vulnerable than necessarily in the war-making part of it. That's, I think, is more coherent there. And the second issue is that Iran is now engaged in a exchange of missiles and drones with Israel. So an open question is, what is Iran's depth here? For how long can it keep up this exchange, right? Because with Israel, we know it's very expensive for Israel to intercept Iranian missiles. It's very expensive for it to carry out the kinds of aerial operations it's doing against Iran. But it will get its supplies that it needs from Europeans and Americans. The question of resupplying Israel, resupplying what it needs is not on the table. But for Iran, it is. It's not going to be able to replenish as fast. So the length of the war, the intensity of the war, how they use what they have in a way to manage the war with Israel, and then let alone if the United States were to enter, is a big part of the question. And I don't know the answer because some of this is intelligence, even if we have it, that I don't have access to.
But can we make a general assumption that the time is not in favor of Iran, the passing of the time?
Well, you could say the other way around, because Iran can be thinking like Russia, that ultimately it's the larger state. It's the strategy that also worked with Iraq. Iraq captured Iran's oil province in a blitzkrieg attack and then couldn't go much further for whatever reason. Then Iran had the depth, the population, etc., to come up with a strategy that was very unconventional, using mass casualties, human wave attacks, etc. But it got rid of the occupiers. So there is a scenario in which you would say that Israel clearly is trying to knock Iran out pretty quickly. That's why it wants the United States to come in as soon as possible. It doesn't want a long war. Let's not forget, Israel has already been at a very costly, exhaustive war in Gaza for 2 years. It wants to occupy Gaza. That war hasn't even finished. And so a long, exhaustive war with Iran is also not something that is in the cards. I think Iran cannot fight with Israel at the pace that Israel is fighting with Iran, but in a longer slug, in a longer back and forth, the outcome may be different.
And you mentioned the Americans. You mentioned that the Israelis want to bring the Americans. It seems that they at least placed a request. Some of the American officials stated it. Do you think Americans would get involved?
I don't know if they will. I mean, definitely if Iran were to kill American soldiers, etc., they would. And we can see that whether in Iraq or in Yemen, they're showing tremendous of discipline of not hitting American targets. I think, for America getting involved, the calculations are very different from Israel, because Israel does not need to own what happens to Iran after it degrades the state or destroys its nuclear program. America will. I mean, at some point, once America comes in, complete eradication of Iran's nuclear program may require boots on the ground. A chaos in Iran will also involve the United States. If Americans get killed, and they feel like they have to go inside Iran, it will again require American involvement in Iran. So the next step is tricky for the U.S. because I don't think President Trump wants a prolonged involvement in the Middle East. But Iran, and there is no such thing, I think, as a quick fix with Iran. They just bomb it and leave, right?
Yes, that's true. One of the concerns that the United States has, and many others, Israel seems to have it, is that the Fordo facility seems to be quite functional. You have dedicated your entire adulthood life, or maybe even your entire life, to study Iran, among many other things. What do you see it possible that the Islamic Republic, under current circumstances, leaves the NPT? Because there was a talk about it in Majlis, in Parliament, and moves forward to build a bomb.
Well, they may even not leave NPT and still move to build a bomb. I mean, what worries me is that obviously Israel always says Iran wants a bomb to annihilate Israel, but that's, I think, more sort of a way of raising the alarm about Iran's program. But if, from Iran's point of view, the proxies are gone, they're not a deterrent to Israel, to US, from attacking Iran anytime they want, toppling the regime, bombing the cities. Iran's missiles are probably not going to be adequate going forward for deterring Israel or anybody else attacking Iran. So what exactly is Iran's defense? So one idea is, again, go back to example I give, is just basically they say, okay, you know what, resistance is over. We're going to be America's friends from tomorrow.
Yeah.
We're going to remove the need for all of that deterrence. So that's one option. It's possible that somebody will come to power in Iran who will argue that. I don't see it right now. Definitely the supreme leader in Iran is not the one who can or will make that argument. So then the other argument is that there's only one weapon left that could be Iran's deterrence. And that one weapon is a nuclear weapon. Now, Iran's not going to come and broadcast that we're doing this because it's going to invite a lot of pressure, military attack, etc. But it may very well decide that it needs to organize itself, organize its economy, its defenses, its foreign policy in the direction that it needs to get to a nuclear weapon as quickly as it can. It's not going to be easy because there's going to be a race between war and pressure on Iran and Iran getting the weapon. But that's exactly what I mean, is that there is a point at which the US will, the only way of stopping Iran may be to have to go inside Iran and destroy the nuclear facilities with use of American soldiers, find out where they are, etc. Because I think from this point forward, if Iran already does not have sites buried somewhere which we don't know about, it's definitely going to build them. Yeah. And it's going to kick out the IAEA even without leading NPT. And US and the international community is going to be much more blind to what Iran is doing, where and when. And they're going to go deeper in the ground. It's going to take them longer, but barring a war, it's going to be very difficult to take that away from them. That's why exactly a nuclear deal would have been a much better option than contemplating war with Iran, because that then the cost of this is going to be quite substantial, and the outcome is going to be very unpredictable.
Thank you. Which brings us, that was all I need. Which brings us to my last question, and I appreciate for giving your time. Do you think the Islamic Republic survive this conflict? And if it survives, how would you see the Islamic Republic post the war? How would it behave? How would it look like?
I think the only scenario in which it would be absolutely surely removed is if there's an invasion of Iran, much like Iraq, Germany, Japan. I don't think there's an alternative to the Islamic Republic because there's no movement, political movement, leadership, anything else over there. Mm-hmm. So the question is not whether the Islamic Republic will survive. The question is, how will the Islamic Republic evolve after this war, mm-hmm. right? Whether the supreme leader survives this war, whether he dies in 2 years, whether he signs a surrender treaty, whether he refuses. I think the key question is that Iran has been for the past 4 or 5 years at that moment where revolutionary regimes may change. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that one group of people leave and then another group completely comes in. These kinds of transformations happen by a new leadership from among those in the state rising to the top with a different philosophy, mm-hmm. either more radical or much more moderate. So, you're looking, are you going to have a Deng Xiaoping come out of this? Or another Mao come out of this? And it all depends on what the mood of the Iranians are. Mm-hmm. How does this war end? And and what kind of devastation it does to Iran, because all of those are important factors in terms of where do we go once the dust settles. But I do think that the Iranian public right now will support the order there is, will not rise up. I don't think these arguments that this is an opportunity for them to rise up will happen. They don't have a leadership, they don't have an organization, and they don't know what rising up means and where it's going to take them, right? So this is all, political talk. But there is a moment after which, when this war is done, that there's going to be a reckoning for the Islamic Republic, for its strategy. Depends on whether the people blame the Islamic Republic or they blame Israel, for instance, at that point, and what the people demand going forward. It's not the mood of the people now may not be the mood of the people, a year from now. It all depends on what they go through during this period.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nasr. Thank you for your time. I appreciate that. And to our audience, thank you for being with us. Thank you for watching this up until now. I want to ask you one more favor. Before leaving this webpage, please go to the caption of this video. There is a link to Dr. Nasr's recent book, Iran's Grand Strategy. You can order it from the Amazon through the link. Get it, enjoy it, and let us know what you think of it. Thank you very much, and tune in for our future episodes.